The letter trembled in my hands as I stood in the attic of my childhood home, dust particles dancing in the afternoon light that filtered through the small window. My grandmother had been dead for 3 weeks, and I was supposed to be sorting through her belongings, deciding what to keep and what to donate. Instead, I had just discovered something that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. The yellowed envelope was addressed to no one, sealed with wax that had cracked with age, and inside was a single sheet of paper with words written in shaky handwriting. To whoever finds this, I am sorry. The truth died with those who were too ashamed to speak it, but I cannot let it die with me. What I am about to tell you will change everything you believe about who you are. My heart pounded as I read on, and with each word, each revelation, I felt the ground beneath my feet shifting. This was not just my grandmother's secret. This was a truth that had been buried for over 150 years, a truth about blood and bondage, about love and betrayal, about a family that had built its legacy on a foundation of lies. And I was about to uncover it all. There was no lock, just a simple brass latch that opened with barely any resistance. Inside were letters, dozens of them, bound together with ribbon that had faded from blue to gray. But it was the envelope on top, the one sealed with wax, that caught my attention. My grandmother's handwriting was unmistakable, though shakier than I remembered. It was dated just 3 months before her death. I broke the seal and began to read, "To whoever finds this, I am sorry. The truth died with those who were too ashamed to speak it, but I cannot let it die with me. What I am about to tell you will change everything you believe about who you are." In 1847, my great-grandfather, Colonel Thomas Thornton, purchased a young woman at a slave auction in Charleston. Her name was Sarah, and she was 18 years old. She was listed in the estate records as property, valued at $800. She was brought to Willowbrook, to work in the main house, to serve the family that owned her. This much is recorded history, the kind you can find in any archive. What is not recorded is what happened next. Sarah was beautiful, with skin the color of warm honey and eyes that, according to the one letter that survived, held the wisdom of ages. Colonel Thornton's wife had died 2 years earlier in childbirth, and he was a lonely man. Sarah was brought into his household, and within a year she was pregnant with his child. The child was born in secret in the winter of 1849. It was a girl, and she had her father's gray eyes and her mother's soft features. The colonel could not acknowledge her publicly without destroying his reputation and his standing in society. But he could not abandon her. Ed, the letter. I read it again, and then a third time, each word sinking deeper into my consciousness, rearranging everything I thought I understood about myself, about my family, about the house I was standing in. I was not who I thought I was. I reached into the chest and pulled out the bundle of letters. The ribbon came undone easily, and I spread them out on the dusty floor around me. They were written in 2 different hands. One was elegant and educated, the writing of someone with formal schooling. The other was simpler, more labored. The letters carefully formed as though each word required great effort and concentration. I picked up one of the simpler letters, dated August 1849, and began to read. "Dear Mary, I hope this letter finds you in good health. I am writing from the address you gave me, though I am still not certain this city will become my home. The baby is well. She grows stronger each day, and when she looks at me with those gray eyes, I see him. I hate that I see him. I hate that I cannot look at my own daughter without remembering what was done to me, without remembering that I had no choice, that my body was not my own, that even my child is not wholly mine. The colonel sends money each month. It arrives in plain envelopes with no return address. It is generous, more than enough for me to live comfortably, to ensure the baby wants for nothing. I suppose I should be grateful. That is what he would expect. That is what the world would expect. But how can I be grateful for money earned from my own exploitation? How can I be grateful that he pays me to forget that he stole my freedom, my dignity, my very self? The baby cries less now. I have hired a wet nurse, a kind woman who does not ask questions. I cannot nurse her myself. Every time I try, I am overcome with such rage and sorrow that my milk will not come. What kind of mother am I? What kind of woman? I do not recognize myself in the mirror anymore. I was raised to be strong, to endure, to survive. My mama taught me that survival was the greatest victory a slave could achieve. But is this survival? living in a city where no one knows my name, where I must pretend to be someone I am not, where I must raise a child who is half of everything I despise. I do not know how long I can bear this, but I must. For her. She did not ask to be born into this impossible situation. She deserves a chance at a life that I never had. And so I will stay. I will take his money. I will raise his daughter, and I will hate him every single day for the rest of my life. Your friend in sorrow, Sarah. I sat in the silence of that attic, surrounded by the detritus of generations, and I wept. I wept for Sarah, whose pain radiated from words written more than 170 years ago. I wept for the child she could not love fully, for the impossible choice she had been forced to make, and I wept for myself, for the sudden and complete shattering of my understanding of who I was. Everything I had been taught about my family, about our history, about our place in the world, was built on this foundational lie. The Thorntons were not simply an old Southern family with a complicated past. We were the living embodiment of that complication, the biological proof that the neat categories we use to organize the world into black and white, slave and free, victim and oppressor, were never as clear as we pretended they were. I gathered the letters carefully and carried them downstairs to the study, the room where my grandmother had spent so many hours poring over family records and genealogies, tracing our lineage back through the centuries, as though purity of blood was something worth celebrating. I spread the letters out on her massive mahogany desk and began to read them in chronological order, piecing together a story that no history book had ever told. Sarah had been born in 1829 on a rice plantation in South Carolina. Her mother had been a house slave, her father the plantation owner's eldest son. She was what was called in those brutal times a mulatto, someone who existed in the precarious space between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. She had been taught to read by her mother, who had been taught by the plantation owner's wife in a rare act of defiance against the laws that prohibited educating slaves. When the plantation fell on hard times after a series of bad harvests, Sarah and several other slaves were sold to pay debts. Colonel Thornton bought her because she was young and educated enough to serve as a lady's maid, and because, as one letter brutally noted, she was comely enough to fetch a good price. She arrived at Willowbrook in March of 1847, and by all accounts she performed her duties well. The household ledgers showed that she was assigned to work in the main house, to help with the cooking and cleaning, to assist with the care of the colonel's young son from his first marriage. The son's name was Thomas Jr., and he was 10 years old when Sarah arrived. There were no letters that mentioned him directly, but I knew from family records that he had grown up to fight for the Confederacy, had been wounded at Gettysburg, and had returned home to take over the estate when his father died in 1872. He was my great-great-great-grandfather on the acknowledged side of the family tree, which meant that the child Sarah bore, Elizabeth, was his half-sister. I felt sick. The dynamics of the household began to make a terrible kind of sense. Colonel Thornton had been a widower, lonely and powerful, and Sarah had been completely without power or protection. Whatever had happened between them, it could not have been a relationship of equals. There was no such thing as consent when one person owned the other. The letters between Sarah and Mary chronicled the pregnancy, the birth, and the devastating moment when Colonel Thornton came to Sarah and told her his plan. He could not acknowledge the child publicly, but he would not allow her to be raised as a slave. He would send Sarah away with money enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life, but Elizabeth would remain at Willowbrook, would be raised as a Thornton, would have all the advantages that her mother had been denied. Sarah's letters from that period were almost incoherent with grief and rage. She wrote of wanting to run, to take the baby and disappear into the north, to find freedom for both of them. But Mary's responses, which were also preserved in the chest, were pragmatic and heartbreaking. Where could Sarah go with an infant? How would she support herself? How would she protect her child from a world that would see only her mixed heritage and judge her accordingly? At least if Elizabeth stayed with the colonel, she would be raised with privilege and security. She would have a chance at a life that Sarah could never provide. And so Sarah agreed. She took the money and left her 3-month-old daughter behind, and she never saw her again. The letters continued for years chronicling Sarah's life in Philadelphia, where she eventually remarried a free black man and had 2 more children. She never told her husband about Elizabeth. She carried that secret alone, writing to Mary about the child she had lost, asking for news, begging for any scrap of information about whether Elizabeth was well, whether she was happy, whether she ever asked about the woman who had given birth to her. Mary's letters in response were kind but sparse on details. She wrote that Elizabeth was healthy, that she was being educated, that she seemed to be treated well by the colonel. She did not write about whether Elizabeth knew the truth of her birth. From the later letters, it became clear that she did not. Elizabeth grew up believing she was the orphaned daughter of a distant cousin. She married a man from another prominent Virginia family. She had children of her own, and she lived her entire life as a white woman, accepted into the highest levels of Southern society, never knowing that her mother had been enslaved, that her very existence was the product of an act that, had it been publicly known, would have destroyed the family that claimed her. It was only when Elizabeth was an old woman, dying in 1920, that she learned the truth. There was a letter in the chest from her own daughter, my great-grandmother, describing the conversation. Elizabeth had called her to her bedside and told her a story that her father, Colonel Thorne, with pride, talking about the family's role in the founding of Virginia, their contributions to the state's development. I had told that story without ever mentioning the people who had been enslaved here, the labor that had built this house and maintained it, the lives that had been spent to create the wealth and leisure that the Thorntons had enjoyed. And now I knew that I was connected to both sides of that story in the most intimate way possible. I finally stood up and turned on the desk lamp. The letters seemed to glow in its light, pages filled with pain and truth that had been hidden for so long. I knew I needed to learn more. I needed to understand the full extent of this history, to trace Sarah's life beyond these letters, to find out what had happened to her other children, whether there were descendants who had no idea that they were related to me, to this house, to this legacy of slavery and silence. But I also knew that this journey would be painful and complicated, that it would force me to confront things about my family and my own identity that I had never had to face before. It would be easier to close the chest, to burn the letters, to keep the secret as my grandmother and her mother before her had done. No one else needed to know. I could preserve the family reputation, maintain the carefully constructed narrative of Thornton respectability. But even as I thought it, I knew I could not do it. Sarah's voice was too clear in those letters, her pain too real, her erasure too complete. She deserved to be known, to be acknowledged, to be part of the family story. And her descendants, whoever and wherever they were, deserved to know our own history. I gathered the letters carefully and placed them back in the cedar chest. Tomorrow I would begin the real work of uncovering this buried history. But tonight, I needed to sit with the weight of what I had learned, to let it settle into my bones, to begin the process of understanding who I was now that I knew the truth. I walked through the house looking at it with new eyes. The elegant parlor where the Thorntons had entertained guests. Had Sarah stood in the corner of this room serving drinks invisible and essential all at once? The grand staircase with its polished banister. Had she climbed these stairs every day, carrying laundry or meals or whatever else was demanded of her? The small room off the kitchen that had once been used for storage, was this where she had slept, on a narrow bed in a space barely large enough to turn around in? The house was full of ghosts, and I was only just beginning to see them, unburying the past. The next morning I drove into town to the local historical society. The building was a converted schoolhouse, red brick with white trim, maintained by a dedicated group of volunteers who were passionate about preserving the region's history. I had been there before with my grandmother, who had donated several items from the Willowbrook collection over the years, carefully curated pieces that told the story she wanted told. The director, a woman in her 60s named Margaret Hayes, greeted me warmly. She had known my grandmother well and had attended her funeral, offering condolences and memories of Evelyn's dedication to historical preservation. "Sarah, how lovely to see you," she said, ushering me into her small office. "Are you settling into things at Willowbrook?" "It's a process," I said, trying to smile. "Actually, I've come across some materials I'd like to research, family papers that mention someone I don't know much about, a woman named Sarah who worked at Willowbrook in the 1840s. Margaret's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something I could not quite read. "Enslaved?" she asked gently. I nodded. "Yes. I'm trying to find out more about her, about what happened to her after she left Willowbrook. Margaret was quiet for a moment, studying me with eyes that seemed to see more than I was saying. That's important work, she finally said. We have some records from that period, plantation ledgers and such. Let me pull what we have on Willowbrook. She led me to a small research room lined with filing cabinets and shelves of bound volumes. Over the next hour, she brought me ledgers, tax records, and estate inventories that documented the business of slavery with chilling precision. Enslaved people were listed alongside livestock and farm equipment, their monetary value carefully noted, their skills and physical conditions described in the same dispassionate language used for horses and cattle. I found Sarah in the 1847 ledger. Female, age 18, mulatto, house servant, $800. That was all. No last name, no mention of her mother or father, no acknowledgement of her humanity beyond her utility and her price. The next entry for her was in 1849. Sarah departed. No explanation, no destination, nothing to indicate what had happened to her or where she had gone. She had simply disappeared from the official record, erased as thoroughly as if she had never existed. But I knew she had existed. I had her letters, her words, her pain, and I was determined to find out what had happened to her. Margaret watched me work, occasionally offering suggestions or bringing additional materials. When I finally sat back, frustrated by the gaps in the official record, she surprised me. Your grandmother came here about 6 months before she died, Margaret said quietly. She asked to see these same records. She spent an entire afternoon going through them, and when she left, she looked like she had aged 10 years. I looked up sharply. Did she say why? Margaret shook her head. No, but she did say something that stuck with me. She said, "We spend so much time protecting reputations that we forget to protect the truth." I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I felt tears prick my eyes. My grandmother had been carrying this burden, struggling with whether to reveal it, right up until the end. She left me a letter, I said quietly, about Sarah, about who she really was to our family. Margaret nodded slowly, as though she had been expecting this. I wondered. The Thorntons were not unique in that regard, you know. There are many families in this region with histories that don't match the stories they tell about themselves. It was more common than people want to acknowledge. That doesn't make it right, I said. No, Margaret agreed. It doesn't, but it makes it understandable that your grandmother struggled with what to do. Revealing the truth doesn't just affect you. It affects how people understand this entire community's history. I spent the rest of the day in the research room, copying records and making notes. When I finally left, Margaret walked me to the door. If you're serious about this research, she said, you might want to contact some genealogists who specialize in African American family history. They have resources and methods for tracing people who were deliberately excluded from official records. I can give you some names. I thanked her and took the list she offered. That night, back at Willowbrook, I began sending emails to the genealogists Margaret had recommended, explaining what I was looking for and providing what little information I had about Sarah. The response came more quickly than I expected. A genealogist named Dr. Patricia Washington replied within 24 hours. She specialized in tracing families separated by slavery and had extensive experience working with fragmentary records and oral histories. She was based in D.C. but would be willing to come to Virginia to consult with me. We met a week later in the Willowbrook study. Dr. Washington was a tall woman with silver locks and an air of quiet authority. She listened intently as I explained what I had found and what I was trying to do. "This is delicate work," she said when I finished. "You're not just researching history, you're potentially uncovering living relatives who may have no idea of this connection. Are you prepared for that?" I had thought about little else for days. "I need to know the truth," I said, "and I think they deserve to know it too, but I'm not sure how to go about it without causing harm." Dr. Washington nodded. "Let's start with what we can verify, then we can decide together how to proceed." Over the following weeks, we worked together to trace Sarah's life after she left Willowbrook. Using city directories, church records, and marriage certificates, we confirmed that she had indeed gone to Philadelphia. We found the record of her marriage in 1852 to a man named James Morrison, a free black carpenter. They had 2 children together, a son named William and a daughter named Ruth. Sarah had died in 1889, at the age of 60. According to her death certificate, she had been living with her daughter Ruth and Ruth's family. There was no mention of Elizabeth, no indication that she had ever reconnected with the child she had been forced to leave behind. But William and Ruth had descendants, and with Dr. Washington's help, we began to trace them forward through the generations. It was painstaking work, complicated by moves and name changes and records that had been lost or destroyed. But slowly, a family tree began to emerge. William Morrison had had 3 children. One of them, a son named Thomas, had served in World War I and returned to Philadelphia, where he worked as a Pullman porter. He had married and had 4 children. Dr. Washington was able to trace 2 of those children forward to living descendants. One of them was a woman named Grace Morrison, who was 78 years old and living in Baltimore. "She's your 4th cousin," Dr. Washington said, showing me the family tree she had constructed. "You share Sarah as a common ancestor." I stared at the name on the chart, trying to process what this meant. I had a cousin, a black cousin, who had no idea that we were related, who knew nothing about Sarah's connection to Willowbrook or the Thorntons. "What do I do?" I asked. Dr. Washington was thoughtful. "That's entirely up to you. But if you decide to reach out, I would suggest doing it carefully. This information could be shocking, potentially upsetting. Some people want to know about these connections. Others find them painful or prefer to leave the past buried. I spent days agonizing over the decision. What right did I have to intrude on this woman's life with information she had not asked for? What if she did not believe me? What if she was angry or hurt or wanted nothing to do with me or the Thornton family? But in the end, I could not keep silent. Sarah's story deserved to be told, and Grace Morrison deserved to know the full truth of her own heritage. I wrote a letter, drafting and redrafting it dozens of times. I explained who I was and how I had discovered the connection between our families. I included copies of some of Sarah's letters, carefully selected passages that I thought would help Grace understand the situation without overwhelming her. I provided contact information and made it clear that I would completely understand if she did not wish to respond. I mailed the letter on a Tuesday morning and then I waited. The response came 2 weeks later, not by mail but by phone. I was in the garden at Willowbrook, trying to decide what to do about the overgrown rose bushes that had once been my grandmother, Pride, when my cell phone rang. "Is this Sarah Thornton?" The voice was cultured, careful, with just a hint of a Baltimore accent. "Yes," I said, my heart pounding. "This is Grace Morrison. I received your letter." There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, and I realized she was as nervous as I was. "I don't know what to say," she finally continued. "I've read those letter excerpts 100 times. I've been trying to decide if this is some kind of hoax or mistake, but the way she writes, the things she says, it sounds real." "It is real," I said gently. "I'm so sorry to have contacted you out of the blue like this. I wasn't sure if I should, but I felt like you deserved to know." Another pause. "Then, my grandmother used to tell stories about her grandmother, about a woman who came from the South but never talked about her life there. Family legend was that she had escaped from slavery, that she had left everything and everyone behind to make it to Philadelphia. We always thought the everything and everyone was metaphorical. I never imagined it was literal." "Sarah's letters suggest she thought about Elizabeth every day of her life," I said. "She wrote about wanting to go back, wanting to see her, but being afraid that it would endanger Elizabeth's position in the family. So my ancestor spent her whole life grieving for a child she was forced to give up," Grace said, and I could hear the anger in her voice now. "A child who got to live in privilege while Sarah's other children, my grandfather among them, had to fight for everything they had." "Yes," I said, "because there was no point in trying to soften that truth." "And you," Grace said, "you're descended from that child." "I am, which means we're family." "Yes." Grace laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I don't know how to feel about that. I really don't." "I understand," I said. "I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about it myself." We talked for over an hour that first time. Grace told me about her life, her family, her career as a teacher in Baltimore public schools. She told me about growing up hearing stories about ancestors who had survived slavery and built lives of dignity and purpose, despite everything that had been stacked against them. She told me about the pride she felt in that heritage and the anger she felt at how much had been stolen from them. I told her about Willowbrook, about the letters I had found, about my grandmother's decision to finally reveal the truth. I told her about the internal conflict I was experiencing, about feeling like I did not know who I was anymore. "You're still you," Grace said. "This information doesn't change who you are. It just gives you a fuller understanding of where you come from. The question is what you do with that understanding." Before we hung up, Grace asked if she could come to Willowbrook. "I'd like to see where Sarah lived," she said, "where this all happened." "Of course," I said, "whenever you want." She came the following weekend, driving up from Baltimore on a Saturday morning. I was waiting on the front porch when her car pulled up the long gravel driveway, and I felt a jolt of recognition even though we had never met. She looked like me. Not exactly, of course. Her skin was several shades darker than mine, her hair a different texture, her features shaped by a different combination of genes. But there was something in the set of her jaw, the shape of her eyes, that echoed what I saw when I looked in the mirror. We were family. The resemblance made it undeniable. Grace got out of the car slowly, looking up at the house with an expression I could not quite read. I walked down the steps to meet her, and for a moment we just stood to hear two women connected by blood and history, separated by everything that history had meant for our respective families. Then Grace held out her hand, and I took it, and we stood there holding hands like we were anchoring each other against the weight of the past. "It's beautiful," Grace said, looking at the house. "I hate that it's beautiful." "I know," I said. I gave her a tour, showing her the main rooms, the kitchen, the small room off the back where Sarah might have slept. Grace moved through the house slowly, touching walls and door frames, as though trying to connect with some trace of her ancestor. When we reached the attic, I showed her the cedar chest where I had found the letters. Grace knelt beside it, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Can I read them?" she asked. "All of them?" "Of course. They're as much your family history as mine." We spent the afternoon in the attic, reading through Sarah's letters together. Grace cried when she read about the birth of Elizabeth, about Sarah's anguish at having to give her up. She cried again when she read the later letters, the ones where Sarah wrote about William and Ruth, about the joy she found in raising them even as she carried the grief of the child she had lost. "She survived," Grace said when she finished reading. "Despite everything, she made a life. She had love. She had family. That matters." "It does," I agreed. As the afternoon wore on, we talked about what to do with this information. Grace was adamant that it should be shared, that Sarah's story deserved to be told publicly, that the Thornton family did not have the right to keep this history buried. "I understand you may feel differ, Entley," she said. "This is your family reputation we're talking about. But that reputation was built on lies and exploitation. Don't you think it's time for the truth?" I had been thinking about this question constantly since I found the letters. Part of me wanted to protect my grandmother's memory, to preserve the Thornton name and the legacy I had grown up believing in. But a larger part of me knew that Grace was right. The truth mattered more than reputation. "I agree," I said, "but I want to do it right. I want to tell the whole story, not just the sensational parts. I want to honor Sarah and Elizabeth and all the complexity of what happened." Together, we began to plan. Grace had contacts in the African American history community, people who worked to preserve and share stories like Sarah's. I had access to the Willowbrook archives and the resources to fund proper research and documentation. We decided to work together to create a comprehensive record of Sarah's life and her connection to the Thornton family, and to make that record publicly available. It took months. We hired researchers, genealogists, historians. We tracked down more descendants on both sides of the family. We discovered that Sarah's son William had a great-granddaughter who was a professor of African American studies at Howard University. We found distant Thornton cousins who were shocked by the revelation, but, after the initial surprise, supportive of our efforts to tell the truth. Not everyone was happy about it. Some members of the Thornton family were furious, accused me of betraying my heritage, of destroying the family name for no good reason. One cousin threatened to sue to prevent me from making the letters public. though his lawyer eventually advised him that he had no legal standing to do so. But most people, once they understood the full story, were supportive. Margaret Hayes at the Historical Society offered to host an exhibition about Sarah and the hidden histories of enslaved people in the region. Dr. Washington agreed to curate it. Grace and I would co-sponsor it, sharing the cost and the credit. The exhibition opened in the spring, almost a year after I had found the letters in my grandmother's attic. We displayed Sarah's letters alongside documents from the Thornton family archives, creating a narrative that showed both sides of the story. We included genealogical charts showing how the two family lines had diverged and the descendants they had produced. We created an interactive component where visitors could explore the broader context of slavery in Virginia and learn about other families with similar hidden histories. The opening night was packed. Grace and I stood together, greeting visitors, answering questions, listening to people react to the story we had uncovered. Some visitors were descendants of enslaved people, drawn to see their own histories reflected in Sarah's story. Others were descendants of slaveholders, grappling with the same questions about heritage and responsibility that I had been facing. Near the end of the evening, an elderly black man approached me. He'd been standing in front of the display of Sarah's letters for a long time, reading them carefully. "My name is Marcus Williams," he said. "I'm descended from one of the other people enslaved at Willowbrook. My great-great-grandfather worked in the stables I'm so glad you came," I said. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for doing this, for not hiding it. My family story got lost because nobody wanted to talk about it, nobody wanted to acknowledge it. Seeing this, seeing someone from the other side willing to tell the truth, it means something." I felt tears in my eyes. "Thank you for saying that." He nodded and moved on, and I stood there thinking about how many stories had been lost, how many families had been torn apart, how much history had been deliberately buried or forgotten. But not this story, not anymore. Grace came to stand beside me. "You did good," she said. "We did good," I corrected her. She smiled. "Yeah, we did." Over the following months, the exhibition traveled to other museums and historical societies. It became the basis for a book that Dr. Washington wrote, documenting not just Sarah's story but the broader phenomenon of hidden family connections across the color line. Grace and I were invited to speak at conferences and universities, sharing what we had learned about confronting difficult family histories, and Willowbrook itself began to change. I could not continue to live there, not with the weight of all that history pressing down on every room. But I could not sell it either, could not let it pass into the hands of someone who might erase what we had uncovered. Instead, working with Grace and a team of historians and preservationists, I transformed it into a museum and educational center focused on the lived experiences of enslaved people and the lasting impact of slavery on American families. We restored the house to its 19th century appearance, but instead of focusing on the lives of the Thorntons, we centered the stories of the people they had enslaved. We created exhibits about Sarah, about Marcus Williams' ancestor who worked in the stables, about the cook and the field hands and the blacksmith, all the people whose labor had built and maintained Willowbrook. We turned the main house into gallery spaces and educational areas, and we built a new research center on the grounds where scholars could access the Thornton archives and other materials related to the history of slavery in Virginia. The most meaningful space, though, was the small room off the kitchen, where Sarah might have slept. We left it mostly empty, with just a narrow bed and a small table, the kind of sparse furnishings that would have been typical for enslaved quarters. On the wall we mounted one of Sarah's letters, the one where she wrote about lying in bed at night and wondering about Elizabeth, about whether her daughter was safe and happy, about whether she would ever see her again. Visitors would stand in that room and read Sarah's words, and many of them would cry. Because Sarah's pain was not unique. It was the pain of thousands of enslaved mothers who had been separated from their children, thousands of people who had been denied the most basic human connections, who had survived anyway, who had found ways to love and hope despite living in hell. On the 5-year anniversary of finding the letters, Grace and I stood together in that room. We had become close over the years, sisters in a way, bound by our shared project and our shared blood. We had learned each other's families, celebrated holidays together, supported each other through challenges and changes. D. Oh, you ever wonder what Sarah would think of all this? Grace asked, looking at the letter on the wall. All the time, I said. I hope she would be glad. I hope she would feel like her story finally mattered, like she finally got to claim her daughter and her place in this history. I think she would, Grace said. And I think she would be proud that we found each other, that we didn't let the silence continue. I took Grace's hand, the same way I had that first day when she came to Willowbrook. I'm grateful, I said, for all of it, for finding the letters, for finding you, for learning the truth, even though it was hard. Me too, Grace said. We stood there in silence for a while, two women from two different worlds, connected by a woman who had lived more than a century before, a woman who had been enslaved and exploited but who had survived, who had loved, who had left a legacy that neither of us could ignore. I thought about my grandmother, about the burden she had carried for so long, about her decision to finally tell the truth, even though she knew would twinge everything. I thought about Elizabeth, who had lived her whole life not knowing who she really was, not knowing that her mother had grieved for her every single day. I thought about Sarah, whose pain had echoed through generations, but whose strength had also endured. And I thought about myself, about who I had been before I found those letters and who I had become since. I was still Sarah Thornton, still the descendant of Virginia plantation owners, but I was also the descendant of Sarah, whose last name I had never learned, but whose blood ran in my veins as surely as the Thornton blood did. I was both. I would always be both. And instead of hiding from that complexity, I had learned to embrace it, to let it teach me about the messy, painful, beautiful reality of American history. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows across the grounds of Willowbrook. Grace and I walked out together, past the main house and into the fields beyond, where the people who had been enslaved here had once worked from sunrise to sunset, building wealth for others while being denied the fruits of their own labor. We should plant something here, Grace said suddenly, a memorial garden or something, a place where people can come and reflect on all the lives that were lived here, all the stories we're still uncovering. I love that idea, I said. We talked about what it might look like, what plants we might include, what markers we might create to honor the people whose names we had been able to recover and acknowledge those whose names had been lost. We talked about making it a living space, a garden that would grow and change with the seasons, a reminder that history is not static, that we are always in the process of understanding it more fully. As we walked back toward the house in the gathering dusk, I felt a sense of peace that I had not experienced in years. The weight of the secret was gone, replaced by the weight of responsibility, which was different but somehow lighter. I knew what I was supposed to do now. I was supposed to tell the truth. I was supposed to honor the people who had been erased from history. I was supposed to help build a world where stories like Sarah's were not hidden or forgotten. It would not undo what had been done. It would not heal the wounds that slavery had inflicted, wounds that still shaped American society in countless ways. But it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was witness. It was a refusal to let silence continue. That night, I went back up to the attic one last time. The cedar chest was still there, empty now since we had donated the letters to the museum for preservation and display. But I sat beside it anyway, in the spot where I had first read my grandmother's confession, where my entire understanding of myself had shifted. "Thank you," I whispered into the gathering darkness, speaking to my grandmother, to Sarah, to all the women who had carried this secret and this pain. "Thank you for trusting me with the truth." And in the silence that followed, in the quiet of that old house with all its ghosts and all its history, I felt something shift. Not closure exactly. The past could never be fully resolved. But perhaps something like acceptance, perhaps something like peace. I was Sarah Thornton, descended from both the master and the slave, carrying both legacies, responsible for both truths, and I would spend the rest of my life trying to honor that responsibility, trying to ensure that the stories that had been buried would finally be told, that the people who had been forgotten would finally be remembered. It was the least I could do. It was everything I could do, and somehow, in the doing of it, I had found not just the truth about my family, but also the truth about myself. It meant bearing witness, and so I would